Hey, this is Lama Rod. Thank you so much for joining me for this talk as I explore uh, sustainable activism. And, this is something that's really important to me right now as we are moving through this really reignited period of the movement for Black lives. And of course, for me, in a very real way, I have, from the moment I was born in this body, and into Blackness in this world, I have been a part of the movement, for Black lives, right? Well before the emergence of, any prior movement, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, the Black arts movement, in the past, the more contemporary movements around in 2014 around, the killing of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and with the emergence of like the first inkling, the first really mass movement of Black Lives Matter in 2014, even into this moment where, because of the murder, really actually the lynching of George Floyd, the reemergence of this movement, even within this period of pandemic, right? And many Black people have always been on the front lines of caring for our own lives and trying to care for the lives of those in our community. But as an activist and as someone who was really trained as an activist, who, for me, really spent much of my teens and my 20s before coming into training, to become a Lama, a Buddhist teacher. I really spent those years just really on the streets, organizing, working with folks, working with the communities I identified with who were really victimized by these systems of oppression, these systems of power that create a lack of resources and disadvantage and disprivilege for folks in marginalized groups, right? So some of the things I've learned, I've been able to enhance through my practice within Dharma and Buddhism that I would like to share, because I think when we get involved in movements, we should be involved for our lives, our whole lives, the entirety of our lives. And it's really hard to avoid the burnout. Is really hard to avoid the ways in which we keep running into walls and how we're choosing to be involved and active in certain movements around justice. So I wanted to really just start, laying out just a few kind of points. I have these points kind of arranged into 3 parts. And so the first part is really about understanding activism and understanding movements. And I think that when we come into really getting concerned about injustice, we have to really have a clear understanding of what it is that we're doing, right? We have to have clear intentions about what we're doing. I was very fortunate as a young activist, in my late teens and getting into my 20s, to really have this space to cultivate an intention, right? And my intention was to disrupt systems of violence, right? To disrupt systems of violence that created marginalization, for so many groups of people in this world. I wanted to bring a critical awareness to these systems, and from that critical awareness, I wanted to develop actions, really a plan that would guide me in really engaging and how to disrupt these systems. And so much of that intentionality is really about education. It's really about doing the reading, doing the homework, right? As one of my favorite public figures, Andre Leon Talley, who's an icon, Black gay man within the fashion industry, someone who I really admire quite a bit, always says you have to do your homework. And doing your homework means that you really have to do the studying, you have to do the reading, you have to pick up the books, right? And just off the top of my head, it's about reading Angela Davis and learning about mass incarceration, the intersections of gender, class, race, in terms of justice. Maybe it's reading James Baldwin to have understanding of what exactly the impact of white supremacy is for us. Maybe it's reading Malcolm X, to really get this kind of perspective of what it means to embody Black agency and Black power. Maybe it's reading Gloria Steinem to get another understanding of what feminism is for us. There's so many thinkers and writers and activists who have produced really important work. And one of the kind of areas of scholarship that's really deeply influencing me is abolition studies, right? It's just going back into the work that people have done to think about freedom and how to think intersectionally. Thinking about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed our understanding of intersectionality, right? And just understanding how identity works to create realities of oppression for so many people, maybe including ourselves. It both creates realities of oppression and also creates realities of privilege as well. So doing those readings, doing that education, having discussions, right? One of my favorite aspects of activism and activist culture and movement work is really how we get together into groups and have dialogues. And we're having what we used to call, when I was a member of a Catholic worker community, we used to call it clarification of thoughts. And for me, the Catholic worker movement has been such a deep influence for me. And the Catholic worker movement began during the Depression in New York City, Depression, 1920s and 30s. And how really radical Catholics got together and just were asking themselves, how can they begin to embody the radical work of Christ, but they were so deeply influenced by these systems of thoughts, these liberatory systems of thoughts like socialism, communism, and these kind of revolutionary thinkers and writers of that time, and they really absorbed that and integrated that with their faith. In the same way, I think that if you identify, particularly as a Buddhist, as a Dharma practitioner, you can take these radical systems of thought and liberation and bring them into the work that you're really interested in terms of like liberation, social liberation, right? I'm very much, into liberation theology, which for me, again, it's about thinking about spirituality and practice and religion as it relates to those who are most oppressed in the world. Also as one of the creators and founders and thinkers of radical Dharma, where we believe that we're having to bring both social liberation and ultimate liberation together to create this really dynamic and powerful push towards liberation across the board on all fronts, right? And that's ultimately what I'm really believing in, is just liberation on all fronts. Like, what does that mean to not just work towards climate change, but to say, climate change is linked to trafficking, is linked to racism, is linked to capitalism, is linked to the Me Too movement, right? And how's all of that relate to ultimate liberation, ultimate freedom? And how I bring all of this together. And that's really so much a part of how I keep my work sustainable, because both ultimate liberation work and social liberation work begin to feed one another. They begin to interact, and that's so incredibly important in our work. Asking ourselves where we fit in as part of this kind of education and understanding movement. Like, what is my work in my activism and in my movement building? What do I fit in? And if you look at just the history of movements, there have been so many people who've done so many things. And sometimes our activism doesn't look like us being on the streets, being at the marches, being at the protests, because that's a specific kind of thing that some folks really, they just don't have the capacity for a variety of reasons. And that's not a judgment at all, because I honestly, authentically believe that there is more work to do than just showing up at the march and the rally. There's so much work that can be done online. There's so much work that can be done around fundraising. There's a lot of work that's done in our interpersonal relationships. So a lot of movement work is really about talking to the people around us, talking to our housemates, our families, our partners, our lovers, and we're just saying, hey, have you thought about this issue, right? Have you, and what are you doing? Can I help? Can I support you? Can we support each other? And thinking about how we are a part of this system that may be creating violence for others, So sometimes, our movement work is about, okay, let's go door to door, let's talk to people on the streets, let's write. So much of my movement work, so much of my activism is about writing. It's about thinking through these issues. It's about teaching and offering workshops. It's about doing exactly what I'm doing now, just offering what I can around my own thinking and work, around how to be in the world and to be conscious and involved in the world. So that's incredibly important. I have this understanding, this belief around allyship, and allyship is a word that I don't necessarily use as much as I used to. But for me, allyship is for me trying to get to this understanding that I'm trying to figure out what my front line is, right? And sometimes being an ally isn't enough in the traditional sense, and that traditional sense of allyship means that, I'm going to support you. I'm not a member of the community, that you're a part of. I may not actually experience this privilege or the intersectionality that you and those in your community are experiencing, but I'm going to show up and offer my support and do what I can, and also to bring my privileges into this mix in order to create a sense of equity as much as I can to support the liberation of this community, right? And so I still think that's also important work, but what's even more important is for those of privilege, right, to start thinking about your front lines, right? And so I'll use this example of when I think about white supremacy and folks who identify as white. Well, maybe, yeah, it's great that you show up to support Black folks and people of color and individual movements. It's great that you show up at Black Lives Matter with your shirts and your signs and you're doing the reading and the work. I think that's wonderful. But it's even more wonderful for you to ask yourself, how do you disrupt whiteness in your experience, right? How do you begin to disrupt the ways in which whiteness has concretized, and gotten solid in your experience? And how do you begin to disrupt that? Because the more you disrupt whiteness in your experience, the less you begin to participate knowingly or unknowingly within this white supremacist systems that still creates disadvantages and violence for really all people of color, all BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. So doing that work with other white people, right? And we're living in such a wonderful time where there's so many resources now. There's incredible amount of resources. So I'm really interested in white folks doing that work in the same way myself. Though I am queer identified, still I identify as a cisgender man. Therefore, I have a certain relationship of privilege with patriarchy. But I have to do my work around dismantling patriarchy as well, and my own education, and figuring out what my front lines are as well. So moving to the second point, I know that was a lot in the first point, but quickly moving into the second point, I want to talk about resiliency as part of sustainable activism. And part of resiliency means that, in my mind, it feels like falling down and getting up, falling down and getting up. That's how I, embody the kind of resiliency. But resiliency is really, how do we resource ourselves to continue to do the work, right? And part of that resourcing means that I have to get really involved with self-care. And I am deeply influenced by Mother Audre Lorde when she says that self-care is actually self-preservation. Self-preservation is an act of political warfare, right? And so self-preservation is really about sustaining oneself, and that sustaining actually begins to disrupt systems of violence, systems of oppression that were mostly created to annihilate you. So when I survive and thrive, and then I began to frustrate that system that was meant to annihilate me, to silence me, to erase me, right? When she says political warfare, it's political because, racism is this political construct that is meant to annihilate, to subjugate Black people, right? In America, racism was explicitly developed to create a binary between white landowners and enslaved Africans, and then over time, whiteness began to expand. So it wasn't just white male, landowners, but, different kinds of classes of white folks. All classes of white folks really began to fit into whiteness, right? And so when I survive, then that system, I'm disrupting the system. And when I speak, and when I think, and when I organize, and when I'm demonstrating, and when I'm practicing love for those who are trying to annihilate me, I am completely throwing the system back. I'm pushing the system back, bit by bit in that work. So self-care means that, it's self-indulgence. So self-indulgence really means that, like, I do something that looks like self-care, but I'm not interested in returning back to the work of the community, right? Or the work that's meaningful. So when I am doing self-care as self-preservation, I am only taking a break to do something to restore myself in order to return back to the work of my community. Another part of resiliency is joy. Giving rise to joy. I come from and descendant from African enslaved folks, as well as Native American folks, Cherokee, right? And so for me, joy is so much a part of how I was raised. I was raised mostly, all in the Black community in the South. And so even though, life was hard, but life was also full of joy. We learned how to celebrate and dance and enjoy ourselves and laugh, even as, the life of Southern Black folks and life of many people within the African diaspora, which is really intense, really overwhelming. So that joy means that I'm just connecting to this natural part of my mind. That joy begins to hold the space of the struggle of what it means to occupy this body and the relative. And the last part of that is the mourning. So I remember that my heart is broken because of systematic oppression, because of trying to survive in the relative. And so I want to acknowledge that. I want to notice my brokenheartedness. I want to offer it space by not reacting. And I want to allow that energy of the brokenheartedness to move through my experience. And that's so incredibly important. To do the mourning, active, skillful mourning is something that I do every single day. And that's something that I really encourage you to make an active part of your practice. Like, literally, when I feel the energy, that morning, I just stop and I allow it to rise within my experience. So you give it space and you let it move. That's my morning practice, right? Just the grieving morning, just letting it pass through. And that's so a part of movement work and our activism, and creating communities, helping to create communities of care, which is the third point, right? Which is, how do I support my community, my collective, right? The group. And that's important to think about the collective always. Yes, we're individuals, but we're individuals a part of communities. And so when I think about all of this, I think about doing this in the context of community. I think about partnering. I think about collaborating. I think about learning from elders and mentors. I think about how anything that I learn that's beneficial and trying to communicate that, share that with others around me. I ultimately am trying to create more communities of care to support one another. That's really incredibly important for me as well. So thinking collectively, thinking about folks, thinking about others, understanding what other people's needs are, as well as thinking about our needs, right? Being in the world and understanding that you're not alone. Like, even if you struggle with something, you tell yourself, I'm not the only one who's struggling with this. And so that's incredibly important always to think about and to hold in our experience. So this is what I really wanted to share with everyone. Again, we have to educate ourselves about activism and movements, about what our role and what our work is. We have to think about resiliency, self-care, joy, mourning, and we have to think about the collective in this work. So I hope this has been beneficial, and my aspiration is that whatever benefit that has been created in this talk that is dedicated to the liberation of all sentient beings, please, I love you, please continue to do the work of liberation.